Hey guys, tonight we step back in time, not into the warm glow of castles or candlelit halls where lords feast on roasted boar, but into the mud-soaked lanes of a medieval village where you are just another peasant, wrapped in rags, clutching your stomach and wondering whether the brittle roof above your head will last another night of icy winds, because the truth is brutal. If you were actually dropped into the middle of a 14th century January in rural Europe, you probably wouldn't survive long enough to complain. And that's not me being dramatic. That's just math. Since back then, winter was not cozy snow globes and cinnamon drinks. It was hunger, sickness, and frostbite. And yet, somehow, ordinary men, women, and children scraped their way through year after year, enduring conditions that would flatten most of us in a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me your location and local time, because I like to imagine all of us scattered across the world, listening in our own little huts, candles flickering, some of you wide awake, some already half asleep, all gathered together in this strange digital village. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out of your small, timber-framed cottage at dawn, boots crunching on frozen earth breath, fogging the air like a dragon you wish you had to protect. You and everything around you seems lifeless fields, stiff with frost trees like skeletons, chickens, huddled under straw, the silence of winter broken only by the occasional cough from a neighbor's hut. Yet this is where your story of survival begins. Because for a medieval peasant, the cold is not just uncomfortable. It is a daily opponent you wrestle with, and you do not have central heating, down jackets, or a corner store stocked with bread. Instead, you rely on layers of wool that scratch your skin, on a cloak patched so many times it looks like a quilt, and on the fire in your hearth that must be fed with precious wood chopped weeks earlier. The mainstream historical fact hits you. Firewood was so essential that villagers often spent entire autumns gathering, chopping, and stacking it, sometimes traveling miles with carts or sledges to bring back enough to last until spring, because if the stack ran low, you didn't just get cold, you risked death, and disputes over wood rights could spark as fiercely as the flames themselves. Still, despite preparation, you feel the chill creeping in through every crack, so you huddle closer to the hearth, and sometimes you even sleep alongside the family pig or goat, because their body heat helps more than the ragged blanket covering you. And though modern ears may laugh, that proximity is not just practical, but symbolic. You and the animals survive together, a reminder that medieval life is interwoven with creatures in ways we often forget. You chew on stale bread softened with broth, thankful for any warmth in your belly. And think about how scholars still argue whether peasants routinely endured near starvation, or whether their diets, though monotonous, were adequate for survival, because records are patchy. And while some sources describe years of famine where corpses lined the roads, others suggest that in normal winters, people managed with stored grains, salted meat, and whatever root vegetables hadn't rotted in the cellar. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. A cycle of hardship punctuated by occasional abundance. And as you swallow the last bite, you hear your stomach protest for more, but you know there won't be. The quirky tidbit slips into your thoughts. In some regions, people believed that stuffing dried herbs or even horsehair into their boots would keep their feet warmer, a kind of folk insulation. And while you chuckle, imagining itchy soles, you also admit you'd try anything to stop your toes from turning blue. Outside, the wind moans like a ghost over the village, rattling shutters, carrying with it the smell of smoke from dozens of hearths. And you realize every family fights the same battle, each one a flickering island of warmth in a sea of frost. And together, the village forms a fragile archipelago of survival. You step back inside, crouch low by the fire, listen to it crackle, and think about how nights stretch endlessly, about how the darkness feels heavier than the blankets you own, about how every cough in the room could be the start of an illness that spreads quickly in close quarters. Still, you find yourself drifting toward a kind of weary acceptance, because that's what peasants did: endure, adapt, pass stories by the hearth, sing songs to children whose eyes droop with fatigue, whisper prayers that the roof holds through the storm, and wait for dawn, even if dawn looks exactly like the day before, gray and cold. Somewhere beyond your village kings and knights plot wars, monks copy manuscripts by candlelight merchants, travel frozen roads with packs of wool or salt. But here in your tiny hut, the world shrinks to the radius of the fire's glow, to the crunch of snow under your boots, to the rumble of hunger in your stomach. And yet this small, hard world is the one that sustains you. And it is worth describing in every icy detail, because it is the reality that most people alive in the Middle Ages actually knew. And tonight it is yours too, as you close your eyes and let the fire warm, your face promising yourself you will wake and do it all again tomorrow. You wake to a pale, gray dawn that seems less like a new day and more like a continuation of the same endless cold night. Because in medieval winter, light arrives reluctantly and vanishes quickly, forcing you to pack every ounce of effort into narrow windows of daylight. And as you rise from the straw bedding, brushing aside the mice droppings that have gathered near your palate, you will remind yourself that food is your most urgent concern. For warmth without nourishment only delays the inevitable weakness. And so you set about the task of gathering, stretching, and rationing the meager supplies left from autumn's harvest, knowing that every bite counts and every crumb carries you a step closer to spring. You shuffle into the cramped storage space, really just a pit lined with planks and straw, where root vegetables lie stacked in earthen bins, turnips and parsnips shriveled but still edible, onions braided and hung from beams, cabbages pickled in barrels that smell sharp and sour, and a sack of barley, so precious you find yourself whispering a half prayer as you touch it, because you know it must last until fields thaw. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval peasants depended heavily on grains rye, barley, oats often, baked into coarse bread that was the backbone of their diet. And though it might lack the glamour of roasted venison or spiced pies found in noble halls, it provided the calories necessary to keep bodies moving through frigid months. So you picture yourself cutting a slab of this dense loaf, dipping it in weak ale or watered pottage, and chewing slowly, trying to convince your stomach that it is satisfied. Yet even as you plan your rations, you cannot ignore how little variety you face. Day after day of the same bread, porridge, and broth. And while it fills, it does not delight. And so your mind drifts to the quirky tidbit that some villagers spiced up meals with dried fish skins or even added ground acorns to flour when supplies ran low, producing bread that tasted bitter but kept bellies from aching. And you imagine sitting by the hearth, biting into such a loaf, grimacing but grateful all the same. The cold air makes everything harder. Hands stiffen as you chop vegetables, lips crack. As you sip broth, and even fetching water from the village well becomes a perilous task. For the bucket rope is frozen stiff, the rim of the well slippery with ice, and you remember tales of children falling in during winter, lost forever in the dark frozen water below. Food preparation is slow, often communal, with neighbors sharing what little they have. Because survival is not a solo game. Here it is a collective effort, and families barter a jar of pickled cabbage for a bundle of dried beans, or exchange a loaf for a share of salted pork. And while you sometimes feel cheated in these trades, you know that without them, your own supplies might not stretch to spring. Scholars still argue whether peasants faced near constant famine every winter, or whether only certain years brought true starvation, because records often reflect catastrophic moments. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rains ruined crops and millions died yet. Everyday winters likely varied widely, harsh for some, manageable for others, and the debate lingers. Were most winters survivable with hardship, or were they always near the edge of collapse? As you sip the thin broth simmering over the fire, made from cabbage leaves, an onion, and a splash of ale for flavor, you lean into the steam and feel your face thaw slightly, and you think about how meals are not just sustenance, but rituals. Times to gather, to share stories, to distract from gnawing hunger. And you picture yourself listening to your children laugh at a silly rhyme, even as their bellies rumble beneath patched tunics. Hunting, though tempting in your imagination, is not often realistic. Forests are owned by lords, and poaching is a crime that could cost you an ear, a hand, or even your life. So instead, you set snares for rabbits or hope to catch a hedgehog. Animals small enough to avoid the Lord's notice, but still nourishing, though cleaning and roasting them is hardly a feast. Occasionally, you hear tales of villagers boiling bones over and over to extract every drop of fat, every trace of marrow, stretching one carcass into a week's worth of soups, and you consider that frugality both pitiful and genius. In your darker moments, you recall whispers of survival, turning desperate of families eating bark moss, even leather scraps. And while such stories sound extreme, you admit they might not be exaggerations in bad years, and you feel a chill run down your spine, not from the cold, but from the thought of being driven to such measures. Yet even amid this harshness, you notice how peasants find joy in small culinary victories. The sweetness of honeycomb saved from summer hives, the tart burst of a dried berry tucked into porridge, the warmth of mulled ale brewed with a pinch of spice purchased from a passing merchant, and you realize that survival is not just about filling the stomach, but about feeding the spirit too. Because without those small pleasures, endurance turns into despair. You glance at the neighbors' huts, smoke curling from their roofs, and know that inside each family mirrors your struggle, stretching loaves, watering down broth, guarding stores from rats, and praying that sickness does not sweep through and spoil the little food you do have, because one ill child coughing over the barley could taint everything. The day crawls by, the sun low in the sky, and you portion out food carefully, perhaps one meal in the morning and one in the evening, because grazing or indulgence is not an option. you find yourself calculating constantly. How many turnips left? How many cabbages still firm? How many days until spring shoots might appear? Hunger becomes not just a sensation, but a background hum to every action. A drumbeat in your belly, reminding you that time and food are racing toward a finish line together. And yet, somehow, despite scarcity, you endure. You eat, you share, you complain, you laugh, you hope, and by nightfall, though your stomach is far from full, you are still alive, still dreaming of warmer days. And that fragile fact is itself a kind of victory. Proof that peasants had not just empty bowls, but stubborn wills that kept them rising again and again. Even when the world seemed intent on freezing them where they stood. You step outside into the biting wind, the fields now stripped bare of summer's bounty, their skeletal outlines dusted with frost. And you realize that in this bleak season, farming is less about planting and more about scraping by with whatever tasks can still be managed. Because even though the soil sleeps under its icy blanket, the work of a peasant never truly stops. And your days are filled with labor meant to prepare, repair, and preserve. You look at the tools hanging in the shed rust, speckled hoes, bent sickles, wooden rake sand. You know they must be sharpened and mended, for if spring arrives and your tools are broken, you are as good as doomed. And so you sit with a grindstone, slowly honing edges until sparks leap like tiny fireflies into the cold air. Your fingers numb, but your mind fixed on survival. Farming in winter shifts from outward growth to inward focus. You tend animals, patch fences, mend roofs, cart manure to spread on frozen fields in the hope that nutrients will sink in when thaw comes, and every task you perform is like leaving a breadcrumb trail for the future. You hope will still exist when snow melts. You crouch down by the chicken coop, checking if any hens are still laying, though, in truth, eggs are scarce in winter as daylight dwindles and hens retreat into survival mode, and you sigh at the memory of summer when baskets overflowed with them golden and warm, ready for pies or boiling. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval peasants practiced seasonal farming rhythms, meaning their work was dictated entirely by the turning of the year, with winter reserved less for planting and more for tool maintenance, household repairs, and survival planning. And this rhythm was so ingrained that it shaped not only agricultural patterns, but social and religious life, because festivals, holy days, and communal tasks all revolved around these agricultural cycles. Still, while the fields are quiet, you can't shake the knowledge that survival depends on how well you managed the previous harvest. And so your thoughts circle constantly around what could have been done better. Should you have sowed more rye, built larger stores, begged the Lord for extra grazing rights? And then, a quirky tidbit sneaks into your mind that some peasants in northern Europe experimented with sowing winter wheat, crops that lay dormant under snow and sprouted quickly once thaw came, almost like sleeping seeds biding their time. And though not every village embraced it, the idea that food was already waiting beneath the snow must have been comforting in its way, like a secret pantry hidden by nature itself. As you trudge along the barren furrows, your boots crunching in icy soil, you feel both pride and despair. Pride because you shaped this land with your hands. Despair because in winter it offers nothing in return. And here lies one of those scholarly debates historians still argue whether peasants in medieval Europe truly faced 4 months of near idleness in winter, or whether their work simply shifted to indoor tasks like spinning, weaving, mending, and brewing, and the truth is likely somewhere in between, with no one truly idle, because in a society where survival hangs by a thread, there is always something to do, always some corner to mend, some supply to stretch, some animal to feed. You think about manure spreading again. One of those tasks often overlooked in tales of heroic knights and noble feasts, but which in truth is the gritty backbone of survival. Trudging into frozen pastures with a barrow of steaming dung, scattering it over fields so that, come spring, shoots might rise with a bit more vigor. And as you do it, the smell is rank and the cold unforgiving. But you know that without it, your yields will suffer and your family will go hungry. And hunger is always there, not only in your stomach, but in your imagination, because you can already picture what will happen if spring crops fail. Less bread, fewer animals, more desperation. You glance toward the woodpiles stacked but dwindling, and remind yourself that winter farming is as much about wood as it is about soil, because without enough timber for fires, food storage rots, tools crack in the cold, and bogies freeze, so you often spend days trudging to nearby forests, gathering sticks and branches, all the while careful not to stray too far into the Lord's woodlands, for that could brand you a thief. Yet, in the quiet moments, there's an odd sense of peace. The land blanketed in snow seems almost asleep, and you too are granted pauses where you can sit by the hearth, patch clothes, carve wooden handles for next season's hoes, or tell stories to your children about summers of abundance. The silence of the fields echoing like a promise that they will awaken again. Your back aches from hauling water, from carrying manure, from chopping wood, but still, each task is lighter than the frantic harvest days of autumn, when every moment is consumed by reaping, storing, threshing, and winnowing. Now the work has slowed, even if it hasn't stopped, and you can sense in your bones the rhythm of the year, a rhythm peasants know better than any church bell or calendar, because it is carved into the land and into your very survival. And so you trudge across icy furrows, breath misting in the air, hands chapped and raw, still preparing, still laboring, still believing that, with enough grit and enough luck, the seeds buried in the soil will rise again. And when they do, you will look back on this winter and know that though the fields gave you nothing, your determination in tending them gave you everything. You wake to the sharp pang of hunger, gnawing at your belly, the kind of hollow ache that makes you wonder not what you will eat, but if you will eat. And this is the grim reality of surviving winter as a medieval peasant, because food is never abundant and the cold stretches on longer than your supplies ever seem to last. So every day becomes a mental puzzle of stretching, rationing, and sometimes simply going without. And as you sit by the hearth, you glance at the pantry corner, where a sack of rye flour hangs like the last hope of bread. A few onions shrivel in a basket, and a salted slab of pork lies wrapped in cloth, all of it dwindling far too quickly, leaving you with the constant dread that the end of winter will arrive after the end of your food. You know the mainstream historical fact, well, that medieval peasants subsisted mostly on bread pottage and ale, with meat being a rare treat, usually reserved for feast days or when animals grew too old to keep, and bread itself was not always the fluffy golden loaf that modern minds imagine, but often dense, coarse, and sometimes even adulterated with ground-up beans, peas, or even bark in times of desperation. So when you chew it, your teeth grind not only grain, but grit, leaving your gums sore and your patience thinner by the day. You ladle out pottage, that endless stew of whatever is on hand. Grains, roots, herbs, the occasional scrap of bacon in. Though the taste grows monotonous, it fills the belly just enough to stave off weakness, and you sigh, knowing that this single dish is both your greatest comfort and your most dreaded monotony. Sometimes when luck smiles, you catch a rabbit or snare a bird, their meager meat flavoring the pot, and you thank the saints for variety. But more often than not, you face only the same gray, slurry bowl after bowl. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants were known to thicken pottage with leftover ale or even snow if water was scarce. And though the idea of eating snow-flavored gruel seems absurd, you have found yourself tempted more than once, because absurdity fades quickly when hunger sharpens its claws. Historians still argue whether medieval famine was a constant annual specter for every peasant, or whether only especially bad harvest years plunged entire regions into crisis. And while scholars debate charts and yields, you live the truth in your own body. Even in good years, winter stretches the limits of what the harvest can provide. And in bad years, it is not uncommon to see neighbors swollen with starvation, bellies bloated, eyes sunken, and voices weak as whispers, begging for crumbs that simply do not exist. Hunger gnaws not only at your stomach, but at your soul, and you feel yourself growing more irritable, your patience with children thinner, your dreams filled with visions of food honey cakes, roasted goose, even just a slice of fresh bread steaming from the oven end. You wake with your mouth wet with saliva, and your heart heavy with despair. You remember storing food back in autumn, hanging apples in lofts, laying carrots in sand pits, salting pork in barrels, and you shake your head at how quickly all those efforts seem to vanish, eaten away by necessity, nibbled by mice, or spoiled in dampness, reminding you that no preparation ever feels sufficient. You think of ale, weak and cloudy, yet safer to drink than water. And though you sip it daily, more for hydration than pleasure, it dulls your hunger slightly, warming you as it slides down your throat. But it also leaves your head heavy, your mind sluggish, and you know that dependence on ale is both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes you barter for food, with neighbors trading a spool of spun yarn for a handful of beans, or a basket of firewood for a wedge of cheese. And though these small exchanges keep you alive, they also remind you of the fragile interdependence of the village. Because if everyone is hungry, there is nothing left to trade. In the darkest moments, you recall the tales whispered by travelers of famine so severe that families boiled grass or gnawed on leather shoes, desperate for anything to fill their stomachs. And though you pray such horrors never reach your village, you understand deep down that desperation knows no bounds, and hunger is the great equalizer, reducing all dignity to the simple question of who eats and who does not. You push the thought aside, forcing yourself to focus on rationing. You break bread into smaller slices, you ladle thinner portions of pottage, you water down ale until it tastes of little more than barley-flavored liquid. And still, the days seem longer than the food stores every sunrise, mocking your attempts to stretch the impossible. You watch your children lick the bowls, clean their eyes, still hungry. And though you smile at them, your heart aches with guilt, because you cannot give them more without taking from tomorrow's share. And tomorrow always looms like a hungry wolf waiting at the door. Hunger weakens your body, making every chore more difficult. The chopping of wood, heavier the carrying of water, harder. And as your strength ebbs, your risk of illness grows, because the body that starves is the body that succumbs. most easily to the cough, the chill, the infection. And yet, in a strange way, hunger sharpens your sense of life. Every scrap of fat, every dried fruit, every bone boiled for broth becomes a treasure, a feast in miniature. And you learn to savor what little you have with an intensity unknown to the well-fed. You remind yourself again and again that winter is only a season, that spring will bring shoots of green, that lambs will be born, that markets will fill once more. And you cling to that fragile hope as your stomach growls and the snow keeps falling, because hope, as much as bread, is the food that keeps you alive. You sit by the dim glow of the hearth, the hunger that never quite leaves you momentarily quieted, and you think about how even the strongest body can falter if it is left vulnerable to the chill, the damp, and the endless. Illnesses that stalk through winter like silent hunters. And so you focus not only on food or warmth, but on survival through the constant battle with disease. Because sickness is as much a part of your life as cold wind or rough bread. And in these months, when everyone huddles close together in smoky cottages with little fresh air, ailments spread like wildfire through the village, sparing no family. And you know the terrifying truth. Even a cough, seemingly simple, can be the first step toward death. You remember the mainstream historical fact that medieval medicine was deeply intertwined with humors the four bodily fluids of blood: phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and healers, whether learned physicians or local wise women, believed that illness was caused by imbalances. So treatments ranged from bloodletting with leeches to poultices made of herbs, and while some remedies worked by coincidence, others weakened the patient, further leaving survival to the stubborn strength of the body rather than the wisdom of the healer. And as you think about this, you picture yourself lying on a straw mattress, sweating through a fever, while someone places herbs of chamomile and mint near your head. Their fragrance strong, but their true power uncertain. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. One you've heard whispered from neighbors. Some believed wearing a dried toad in a pouch around the neck could ward off fevers, while others swore by hanging garlic braids over doors, not only for flavor, but as a kind of invisible shield against disease. And though it sounds ridiculous to modern ears, you remember that desperation can make anything plausible. So you imagine sewing a small pouch and sliding a strange charm inside, hoping it will keep the children safe. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as ignorant of disease as stereotypes suggest, or whether their methods, while framed by superstition, contain more practical wisdom than we give credit for. Because herbs like garlic and rosemary do contain antibacterial properties. Smoke can drive out pests, and quarantine, though crude, was sometimes practiced instinctively, keeping the ill apart when possible. So the debate continues, and meanwhile you cough into your sleeve and pray it is nothing worse. You recall winters when influenza-like illnesses swept the village, cutting down the old and the very young, and how the priest read last rites over so many that his voice grew hoarse, and the bells tolled until the sound became a permanent echo in your head, and you shiver not from the cold, but from the memory of so much loss. Because in these times, every cough you hear in the cottage makes you wonder if you will be next. You know that lice and fleas, so common in unwashed bedding and clothes, bring more than itching, for they can carry fevers that burn like fire. And you remember boiling your shirt in a pot, the steam filling the room, trying to cleanse it of vermin, though you know they will return soon enough. Rats scurry in the corners, drawn to your dwindling stores of grain. And you cannot help but think of how they carry diseases too. Though the true link between vermin and plague is not something your world fully understands yet, and you shoo them away with a stick, muttering curses under your breath. When illness grips your family, you use what remedies you know. Honey mixed with vinegar for a sore throat, onions pressed to the skin to draw out infection, willow bark tea for fever. And though sometimes these things bring relief, sometimes they do nothing at all, leaving you to wonder if healing is more about faith and patience than any medicine. In the darkest times, you visit the cunning woman at the edge of the village who keeps bundles of herbs drying in her rafters and jars of strange powders on her shelves, and she gives you a tincture, perhaps of sage or yarrow, telling you to whisper a prayer as you drink it, and you nod, because whether it is the herb or the prayer, you are willing to try anything when sickness presses close. You remind yourself that health is not only about treating illness, but about prevention. You keep the hearth smoke curling upward to drive away dampness. You sweep straw onto the floor to insulate against cold. You patch holes where drafts creep in, because every small effort keeps your body from weakening. And weakness is the true door through which death walks in. Sometimes, though, no effort is enough, and you think of friends lost to sudden fevers, their bodies carried to the churchyard under gray skies wrapped in plain shrouds, and you realize that life in this age is precarious, always on the edge, and survival is never guaranteed. Yet you also remember the resilience of your own body, how many winters you have endured, how many sicknesses you have overcome. And you draw strength from the knowledge that even in a world filled with disease, survival is possible, not through magic, but through persistence, through care, and through the stubborn will to keep going. You tend to your family as best you can, making sure they eat what little you have, wrapping them in blankets, muttering charms, half believed. And though you know that disease can take even the strongest, you also know that love and vigilance are your best medicine, because in this world, care itself is an act of defiance against death. And so when night falls and coughs echo from the far end of the cottage, you whisper a prayer, place another log on the fire, and pull your blanket tighter, hoping the warmth, the herbs, and your faith will be enough to see you through another day, another week, another endless winter. You know, as you huddle in the dim, smoky cottage, that winter is not just about keeping warm or avoiding illness, but about making sure your family has enough to eat. And the grim truth is that no matter how well you prepared in autumn, stores always seem to dwindle faster than expected. So you find yourself staring at the dwindling sacks of barley and rye in the corner, wondering how long they will last. And you realize that hunger is as constant a companion as the cold itself, gnawing at your belly in the night, reminding you that survival is always balanced on the edge of scarcity. And this is why food preservation and rationing dominate so much of your daily life in these months, shaping your decisions, your routines, even your dreams. You remind yourself of the mainstream historical fact. Most peasants relied heavily on grains, particularly rye and barley bread, which was coarse, dark, and sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch it further. And though it filled the stomach, it was hardly luxurious. And when grain supplies ran low, famine was never far away. For medieval Europe experienced what is known as the Hungry Gap in late winter and early spring, a period when stores ran out. But the next harvest was still months away, and you shiver at the thought of that gap yawning before you. Even as you try to pace yourself, you cut your loaves thinner, you water down your pottage, so it stretches across more bowls, and you begin rationing more strictly, knowing each mouthful denied today might be the difference between life and death later. And then, as you chew the coarse crust, you think of quirky tidbits, like how sometimes spoiled grain carried ergot fungus, which could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even gangrene. And though you don't know the science, you've heard stories of people acting mad, dancing uncontrollably, or shrieking in terror after eating cursed bread, and part of you wonders whether the whispers of demons in the night are really just the strange effects of poisoned rye. Historians still argue whether peasants truly starved as frequently as chroniclers described, or whether these dramatic accounts exaggerated misery to contrast the suffering of the poor with the plenty of the wealthy. But you know from your own experience that while famine may not strike every year, hunger is a yearly visitor, and whether or not historians agree your stomach tells you the truth, you picture yourself hanging strips of salted pork near the rafters, the fat dripping slowly, a reminder of the pig slaughtered in autumn, whose meat must now last through to spring, and you ration carefully, saving meat for feast days or emergencies, never daring to indulge too freely, because to waste food is to court disaster. You see the pickled cabbages fermenting in their barrel, the sharp temps promising at least some variety when bread grows dull, and you know that such preservation, method salting, drying, fermenting are not luxuries, but necessities, the only way to carry autumn's bounty through the barren months. Even dairy must be transformed into hard cheese or butter so it keeps in. And though you dream of fresh milk, you accept that survival means compromise. When food becomes scarce, you forage even in winter, scraping bark, collecting nettles or wild roots when snow recedes enough to show them. And though such fare is meager, it staves off the worst pansies. Sometimes you even eat things you'd rather not. Thin gruel, flavored with whatever scraps remain. Broth made from boiling bones until they give up their last trace of nourishment. Or dried peas that taste like dust but at least provide substance. You remind yourself that part of preservation is not just about storing food, but about pacing it. The discipline of saying no, even when you are hungry. Teaching children not to beg for more, saving every crumb, because tomorrow is always uncertain. And yet, in the midst of this grim rationing, there are moments of strange joy. A surprise cache of apples found unspoiled in the cellar, a rabbit snared in the snow, or a neighbor sharing a bit of honey, and these moments feel almost miraculous, as though the universe itself is rewarding your endurance. Still, you cannot ignore the hunger that makes tempers short, that makes children cry in the night, that makes you dream of banquets you will never taste, and you realize that hunger is not just physical, but mental, shaping the very way you see the world. You begin to measure time, not by days, but by meals, and each loaf of bread becomes a small victory. You keep careful watch over your stores, tightening the knots on sacks so mice cannot chew through, raising barrels onto planks so damp does not rot them. And you scold anyone who leaves the cellar door open, because vigilance is the only way to make sure every grain is accounted for. You remind yourself again that preservation is a skill passed through generations. How to salt meat properly, how to smoke fish, so it keeps how to dry beans in the sun before frost. And you know that these practices are what stand between your family and famine. At times, though, you find yourself gnawed not only by hunger, but by worry, imagining the hungry gap ahead. And you remember stories of villages reduced to eating bark or boiling leather, and you shudder, promising yourself that you will make your stores last no matter what. The fire crackles, The bread hardens, and you chew slowly, every bite an act of survival. Every crumb, a reminder that preservation is not just about food, but about life itself, rationed and stretched, always on the edge, but somehow enduring. Year after year, winter after winter, you wake to the sound of coughing, not just one voice, but several echoing in the cramped cottage where smoke and damp air mingle. And you realize that winter is not only a test of hunger and cold, but also of sickness, because illness spreads faster in these months than in any other. And when one person falls sick, it seems a whole household eventually follows, with no escape from the recycled air, the shared straw bedding, the close quarters where every cough and sneeze finds its way into another chest. So you brace yourself for the reality that survival also means facing waves of colds, fevers, and sometimes worse, the kind of sickness that doesn't let go. You remind yourself of the mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, respiratory illnesses were incredibly common in winter, partly because of the smoke-filled houses where fires had no chimneys to draw fumes away. So peasants inhaled soot daily, weakening lungs, and partly because damp conditions encouraged mold and rot, all of which created fertile ground for bronchitis and pneumonia. And you imagine yourself wheezing in the night, struggling for breath, wondering whether the air that warms you is also slowly killing you. And yet, people fought back in their own way, reaching for remedies passed down through generations. And though some were effective and others mere superstition, they all carried the same intention: to soothe, to comfort, to buy time. You picture yourself stirring a concoction of honey and vinegar to ease a sore throat, or steeping dried elderflowers in hot water to bring down a fever, and you smile at the quirky tidbit that garlic, often called the poor man's medicine, was believed to ward off not just illness, but evil spirits, too, so much so that cloves were sometimes hung in doorways to repel both disease and demons, a strange overlap of medicine and magic that feels perfectly natural in your world. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies genuinely improved health, or whether their effect was more psychological. But you know that when the nights are long and a child burns with fever, any treatment, whether it heals or merely comforts, is worth the effort, because doing something always feels better than doing nothing. The struggle against sickness shapes your days as much as hunger and cold. You tend the fire carefully, hoping warmth will sweat out the fever. You rub ointments of goose fat and herbs onto chests to ease breathing, and you mutter prayers as you work, asking saints for protection. Because survival often feels like a partnership between the earthly and the divine. Still, there are times when no remedy works, when coughs deepen into rattles and fevers climb until the skin glows hot, and you are forced to face the cruel truth that winter takes its toll through disease as surely as through frostbite, and that death often comes not from cold itself, but from the infections that follow. You remember stories of the Great Famine of 1315-1317, where not only hunger but disease cut down countless lives. And though you hope such disasters will not strike your village, you know they linger always as possibilities. Reminders of how fragile life is when one sickness can tip the balance. You do what you can. You air out bedding when the sun shines. You boil water when you suspect it carries rot. You burn juniper or rosemary to cleanse the air, believing that smoke itself can drive away sickness. And though modern minds might scoff, you cling to every tradition, because survival depends on trust and inherited wisdom. Some remedies surprise you in their oddness, like using powdered toad to treat plague boils, or wearing charms carved with astrological symbols. Though you don't always believe in them, you know others swear by their power, and in desperate times you are willing to try almost anything. Illness also forces you into decisions about work. When someone is bedridden, others must pick up their tasks, and though you are weary, you carry wood, tend animals, and fetch water for those too weak to move, because community survival depends on each person carrying another's weight when needed. You notice how illness shifts the rhythm of life. Meals are smaller because fewer hands can cook, chores fall behind, and days blur together as you sit by the hearth, listening to ragged breathing, counting hours in hope of improvement. Yet there are moments of resilience too, when someone recovers after days of fever. When a child opens tired eyes and smiles weakly, and you feel that indescribable relief, a reminder that not all battles are lost. You accept that sickness is part of winter as much as snow or frost, an enemy woven into the very season. And you arm yourself with what little you have: herbs, prayers, rituals, and above all, patience. You pace your nights, tending the fire, feeding broth to the weak, pressing cool cloths to burning foreheads, and you know that while illness may weaken you, your care for one another is what makes survival possible, for in the end, it is not only the remedies, but the bonds of family and community that pull you through. You realize that survival in the medieval winter is not only about food, fire, or medicine, but also about the shelter that keeps out wind and snow. Because without walls and a roof, everything else becomes useless. And so the cottage you live in, though simple by modern standards, is the center of your existence, a fragile but vital defense against the cold months. And you become aware that every stone in the wall, every beam of timber, every clump of thatch pressed tightly onto the roof is a layer of survival, a line between life and death. And when you look around, you notice the details with new clarity. The walls of wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks plastered with clay, mud, and even cow dung, hardened into something strong enough to block wind. The timber posts driven into the earth, angled and lashed together to form a frame that groans when snow builds heavy on the roof. The thatched layers of reeds or straw tied in bundles, overlapping like scales on a fish to let water run off. Though in winter they sag under frost and must be patched, and the floor of bare earth, softened with straw or rushes that you scatter every so often to keep dampness at bay. You remind yourself of the mainstream historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, the vast majority of peasants lived in such timber-framed houses, often only 1 or 2 rooms, shared by people and livestock alike. And while historians describe them as smoky and cramped, you feel in your bones why they were designed this way. Because animals inside the house brought warmth, their breath and bodies raising the temperature a little, enough to make the difference between unbearable frost and manageable chill. And so you do not see it as filth, but as cooperation, a partnership of species against the cold. Still, you cannot ignore the quirks of peasant homes, the little improvisations that reveal both ingenuity and desperation, like the tidbit about windows being covered not with glass, which only the wealthy could afford, but with stretched animal bladders or thin slices of horn, materials that let in a dull amber glow while blocking the worst of the wind. So you imagine yourself sitting by such a translucent patch, the pale light of a winter sun seeping through, casting your cottage in a strange golden haze. And though it is far from modern glass, it feels magical in its own way, a reminder that beauty can exist even in hardship. Historians still argue whether medieval homes were unbearably miserable, filled with constant smoke, fleas, and damp, whether such accounts exaggerate the discomfort for dramatic effect. But from your own second-person vantage point, you recognize that while the house is indeed smoky and cramped, you also feel the relief of walls against wind, of thatch against snow, and of firelight against darkness. And so you know that misery and gratitude coexist in these cottages. The tasks of maintaining shelter become a daily ritual. You check the roof for leaks, climb with numb fingers to tie down loose thatch, smear fresh daub into cracks that form in the walls, sweep out the rushes that have grown foul with droppings or spills, and spread new ones, fragrant for a time before they too rot. You block drafts by shoving moss or rags into gaps, and you arrange your family's bedding near the hearth where the heat lasts longest. At night, you listen for the groans of beams as frost presses in. You hear the drip of melting ice when the fire grows strong, and you wonder if the roof will hold another storm. Shelter is never finished, never static. It is a living, breathing thing that demands attention, and without it, you would already be dead. You take comfort in how your home mirrors the rhythm of nature. Its walls are literally built from earth and trees, its roof from reeds and straw. So when you huddle inside, you feel wrapped, not only by architecture, but by the landscape itself, the countryside transformed into a protective skin. Yet you also know how precarious it is, because fire, your salvation against cold, can also be its destruction. And you are always cautious, tending flames carefully, never letting sparks fly too freely. Knowing stories of whole villages reduced to ashes in the middle of winter, where survival in one moment becomes tragedy in the next. You remember to place stones around the hearth, to bank embers safely at night, to sweep dry rushes away from fire. And even then, you never sleep entirely easy, because one careless moment could undo everything. And still within these fragile walls, life continues. Children laugh and play in the straw. You share meals by the glow of the hearth. You hear the steady rhythm of animals shifting in the shadows, and you realize that shelter is not only defense, but also the stage upon which your family's entire winter existence unfolds. The sound of wind battering outside makes the interior feel smaller, but also safer, a womb-like cocoon where hardship and comfort mingle. And you imagine how without this cottage you would be wandering in the open, exposed to storms. Snow burying your body, wolves circling frostbite, spreading. And so, even though you curse the smoke that stings your eyes, you also bless the beams above your head. You hear neighbors sometimes bragging of their houses larger, better built, with tiled roofs if they are wealthier. But you know that your modest cottage, however humble, is still part of the chain that links generations of peasants together. The knowledge of construction passed down, each patch and repair a continuation of ancestral skill. The very smell of your house would smoke, earth, animals, straws, the smell of survival. And though it may never appear in poems or grand histories, you understand that without such shelters, medieval peasants would never have made it through even a single winter, let alone centuries of them. You soon realize that winter in medieval times is not only about what happens inside your own home, but about how you connect with those around you. Because isolation in the cold months can be as deadly as hunger or frost, and so community life becomes both a shield and a trap. A web that sustains you, but also demands sacrifices. And you living as a peasant in this era, learn quickly that surviving the season means not only tending your own fire, but also sharing it when necessary. Not only baking your own bread, but also pooling flour when shortages arise. And so every day is shaped by the delicate balance of neighborly cooperation and the quiet fear of rivalry. You attend gatherings in the village church, not always for spiritual reasons, but because its stone walls and communal. Fire offer respite from your smoky hut, and there you listen to gossip and trade. News of whose roof has collapsed, whose ox has gone lame, and whose grain stores are running low. These whispered exchanges carry weight because they tell you who might soon need help and who might be a burden. The mainstream historical fact you recall is that medieval villages often organized collective duties, such as repairing roads, clearing snow, or maintaining mills, because no single household could manage these tasks in the depths of winter, and so you trudge with others to patch a bridge or shovel out a path to the nearest market, grumbling all the while, but secretly grateful that these chores keep you from total isolation. Still, there are quirky details that make you smile even as your fingers freeze, like the tidbit that, during especially harsh winters, villagers sometimes played snowball games or staged rough competitions on frozen ponds, using the season's hazards as a kind of grim entertainment. So you imagine yourself laughing despite the cold, throwing a lump of ice at your neighbor in a rare moment of levity, proving that even in times of scarcity, the human urge for play persists. Yet historians still argue whether medieval winter festivals and communal gatherings were truly joyful events that brightened peasant life, or whether they were more pragmatic, designed to reinforce social order and distract the poor from their suffering. And as you stand in a crowd, listening to carols by torchlight, you sense both possibilities. The laughter is genuine, but so too is the undertone of obedience, the reminder that the village hierarchy lord, priest reeve, and peasantry remains intact no matter the season. Daily community life in winter means sharing not only warmth and stories, but also risk. If one household succumbs to illness, contagion spreads quickly when everyone huddles together, and you recall how the hearth of one family becomes the hearth of many when food is scarce. And while this solidarity keeps spirits alive, it also means you are never free of the shadow of another's misfortune. At night, when storms howl outside and the snow piles higher against your door, neighbors sometimes knock, desperate for a space by your fire, and you feel torn between charity and self-preservation, wondering whether one more mouth will starve your own children. And though religion urges you to give freely, instinct whispers caution, so you weigh every knock like a test of your humanity. In quieter moments, community life offers small comforts. Shared songs, collective prayers, the sound of bells marking feast days that bring temporary relief from labor. And you cling to these rituals because they punctuate the monotony of cold, transforming endless gray days into moments of meaning. You also see how the communal structure dictates survival strategies. The open fields are divided and regulated, wood rights are managed, grazing is overseen, and every decision about resources must be negotiated. And while these rules sometimes feel oppressive, you also know they prevent chaos, because without them, stronger families would hoard all the timber or graze their animals until nothing remained for others. You watch as villagers gather at the manor court, even in winter, disputes about land or boundaries being settled despite snow. and you realize that survival is not just about enduring the weather, but about maintaining fragile social harmony. Still, resentments brew under the surface. You hear muttered curses against a family that hides their stores too jealously, or against a miller who cheats with his measures, and you wonder how easily the bonds of community could snap if the winter drags on too long, hunger sharpening every grievance into rage. Yet for now you find solace in the presence of others, in the flicker of torchlight on familiar faces, in the warmth of a neighbor's hand gripping yours, during a hymn, in the laughter of children who chase each other across icy fields, their joy unbroken by the severity of the season. When you return home after such gatherings, the memory of voices and songs lingers, echoing in the silence of your cottage, reminding you that you are not alone even when the night feels endless. Community is your invisible shield, fragile and flawed, but essential, because without it you would be nothing more than a solitary figure in the snow, fading quietly into the dark. As the nights stretched longer and the winds howled more fiercely around your fragile cottage, you begin to understand that survival in a medieval winter is not a matter of strength alone, but of an intricate dance with faith, ritual, and the unseen world. For when your belly is empty and the fire sputters low, you find yourself clutching at prayers, charms, and whispered incantations passed down from elders who swore by their power. And so you kneel before the simple crucifix hanging on your smoke-darkened wall, mumbling the same words over and over, not always certain that they will change anything, but hoping nonetheless that they might keep illness or famine at bay. Religion is not separate from survival. It is woven into every act, every thought, every fear, and the rhythm of your winter is marked not just by hunger and cold, but by feast days, vigils, and fasts, even when fasting feels absurd in a season already defined by scarcity. Yet still you obey, because disobedience carries its own dangers, both earthly and eternal. The mainstream historical fact echoes in your mind. The medieval church prescribed a strict calendar of fasts and feasts, with nearly half the days of the year requiring some restriction on meat. And so even in the dead of winter, when you might crave fat and flesh most desperately, you find yourself abstaining, substituting fish or legumes if you can find them, though often it means gnawing at stale bread and hoping God sees your effort. At the same time, your neighbors remind you of older, stranger practices, the quirky threads of superstition that persist beneath the church's stern gaze, like the tidbit that hanging a horseshoe above the door was believed to ward off evil spirits or witches who prowled more boldly in the long winter nights. And though priests may frown, you hammer one into your own doorway, muttering a prayer as you do, because you cannot afford to take chances when every shadow feels like a threat. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as superstitious as chroniclers claimed, or whether those tales are exaggerations meant to make peasants look foolish. But as you tuck a sprig of dried herbs into the rafters above your bed, you do not care what future scholars will think. You only know that it makes you feel a little safer, and that feeling in the cold darkness is worth more than reason. Faith offers not only rituals, but also community, and so you drag yourself through the snow to the parish church, where the flicker of candles and the murmur of Latin chants surround you with a sense of belonging, and you find warmth not just in the fire, but in the presence of others, kneeling side by side, whispering their fears to the same, God begging for mercy in the same words. At Christmas, when food is scarce and the cold relentless, you still gather for a shared meal, singing carols that carry echoes of joy even into your hungry stomach. And for a few hours, the hardship lifts, replaced by a fragile but real sense of light in the darkness. You notice, too, how faith dictates practical decisions. Priests urge you to give alms even when you have little, reminding you that charity in winter might save not only a neighbor's life, but also your own soul. And though it stings to part with a chunk of bread, you do it anyway, because the fear of sinning weighs heavier than the fear of hunger. There are moments of doubt, of course, nights when the howling wind drowns out your prayers, and you wonder whether anyone listens. Days when the sight of a child shivering in the cold makes you question divine justice, but you silence these thoughts quickly, because doubt feels as dangerous as starvation, something that could rot you from within. And when illness strikes, when coughing rattles through the village and fevers burn even in the chill air, you cling to blessings, holy water, relics, anything that promises protection, even if reason whispers that these objects are powerless. The rhythm of winter is punctuated by these rituals. Epiphany processions in January, Candlemas in February, each feast like a torch in the long tunnel of darkness, giving you just enough light to move forward. And beneath it all, you sense the duality of faith, part genuine devotion, part survival mechanism. Because when all material defenses falter, belief itself becomes a form of shelter. Intangible but vital, a fire for the spirit. When the hearth fire dies down, you cannot prove it works. But in the endless dark of winter, you cannot risk discarding it either. For hope, however fragile, is as necessary as bread. And so you bow your head again, whispering words into the smoke-filled air, clinging to the possibility that something larger than you listens, that the winter will end, and that you will still be here when the thaw comes. When you wake to the bitter creak of frost on the thatch and the faint groans of timber contracting under the pressure of snow, you know that winter is not just a test of patience, but of endurance in every sense, because your body, pushed to its limits, is constantly walking a razor's edge between strength and collapse, and your mind, fogged with hunger and monotony, drifts into dark corners where hope flickers dangerously low. Yet somehow you push on, step by step, breath by breath, clinging to small rituals and scraps of comfort as though they were treasures. For in the medieval village, survival in the cold months depends not only on food and fire, but on the ability to hold yourself together, body and soul. You rub your stiff hands, feeling how the skin cracks and splits from cold and rough labor, and you realize that healing is not easy here. That without modern ointments or warm baths, every wound, however small, can fester, and so you coat the cracks with animal fat or beeswax. If you are lucky enough to have some muttering thanks that nature at least offers some crude remedies, the mainstream historical fact runs through your mind. In the Middle Ages, peasants relied heavily on herbal medicine, with remedies recorded in manuscripts like the Anglo-Saxon Leech Book, prescribing plants such as sage, garlic, and horehound to combat winter ailments. And though you are no scholar, you rely on the knowledge of the village wise woman who knows which roots to boil, which leaves to steep, and which poultices might draw out infection, even if she couches her recipes in whispers of charms and prayers. And then there are the quirks, the details that make you smile, even in misery, like the tidbit about how some peasants believed placing a live frog in one's mouth could cure a toothache, and while you shudder at the idea, you know Someone in your hamlet has probably tried it, because when pain gnaws at you in the long nights, you grasp at anything, no matter how bizarre. Historians still argue whether these remedies were truly effective, or whether they functioned more as placebos wrapped in ritual. But in your lived experience, belief itself carries weight. And when you swallow a bitter brew of willow bark to ease your fever, you convince yourself that relief is coming, and sometimes that conviction is enough. Beyond the body lies the harder battle. The mind restless in the endless dark, aching for stimulation. In days that blur together, so you occupy yourself with small crafts, carving wood, by the hearth mending worn clothes, telling and retelling stories that stretch back generations. Because without these distractions, despair creeps in too quickly, and despair, you realize, can kill as surely as frostbite. You notice how people lean more on community during these months, visiting neighbors. Despite the snow-sharing gossip, laughter, even the occasional song, because voices and warmth stave off the silence that otherwise hangs like a shroud. And though you sometimes resent the crowded cottage and the lack of privacy, you know that solitude in winter is its own kind of death sentence. Dreams to become a kind of sustenance. You find yourself dreaming of spring, of green fields and bleating lambs, of fresh bread steaming on the table. And when you wake disappointed, you cling to those images like promises, allowing them to soften the sharpness of your hunger. There are moments of sheer stubbornness as well, when you curse the cold, slam the door against the wind, and refuse to yield. And in those moments, you realize that survival is as much about will as about resources. You remember stories told by elders of winters so harsh that wolves roamed the outskirts of villages, bold enough to test the courage of men at their doors. And though you have not yet seen such beasts this year, you hear howls on the wind and wonder how close desperation might bring them. Yet even this fear steals you, because you know that fear can sharpen as much as it can weaken. And in sharpening, it keeps you alive. The days drag on, one after another, your belly rumbling, your breath visible in the air, even indoors, your mind aching for warmth. And yet beneath it all, you begin to marvel at your own resilience. Because despite everything, despite the pain, the hunger, the monotony, you endure. And that endurance itself feels like a quiet victory. In a world where death waits around every corner, the simple act of drawing breath on a winter morning, of standing and stepping forward, is resistance. And that resistance, repeated day after day, builds into something monumental. Survival. When the snow hardens into icy ruts along the paths and the trees groan under the weight of frozen branches, you begin to realize that surviving a medieval winter is not only about enduring your own hardships, but about navigating the fragile web of relationships that tie you to others. Because in a world where resources are scarce and temper short, cooperation and conflict live side by side, and every interaction with neighbors, lords, and family members carries the potential to secure your survival or tip you into deeper danger. So you tread carefully, measuring your words as much as you measure the grain left in your sack. You know that within the cramped cottages, patience runs thin. Children cry from hunger, elders grow irritable with aches, and siblings squabble over scraps. And in that press of bodies, anger can flare as quickly as frost spreads across a window pane. So you learn to soothe, to distract, to remind others of the shared struggle. For the last thing you need is the vision inside the one fragile shelter you call home. Beyond your door, the village itself is a shifting network of favors and debts. Perhaps one household has a little extra salt poured, another a store of beans, another a supply of firewood, and through negotiation, barter, or pleading, you cobble together enough to keep going, though each exchange feels precarious, as if one sharp word might collapse the entire fragile system of mutual aid. And always looming above you is the manner, the presence of the Lord or his steward, reminding you that even in the worst winter, your obligations to authority do not vanish, because rents and dues must still be paid. Often in kind, with grain or poultry you can scarcely afford to part with. And the resentment that burns in your chest is tempered only by fear of punishment. For disobedience carries consequences as harsh as the cold itself. The mainstream historical fact weighs on you here. Manorial records show that peasants were often required to perform labor services for their lords, even in the winter. Months clearing paths, repairing fences, or carting wood. And though you might beg for respite, obligation rarely bends to mercy, forcing you out into the snow when your body cries to remain by the hearth. Yet there are moments of generosity to surprising flashes of humanity when a neighbor slips you a piece of bread or a noble donates firewood to the parish for the poor. And these gestures remind you that even in a harsh hierarchy, compassion sometimes pierces the ice. You also recall the quirks of village life, like the tidbit that in some places peasants held winter ales or communal drinking feasts, pooling what little they had into a shared celebration that lifted spirits and cemented bonds, even if it left a few with sore heads the next morning. And though you might think it reckless to waste ale when supplies run low, you see how such gatherings knit the village together, binding people with laughter, song, and the shared rebellion of joy against hardship. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were truly as cooperative and harmonious as the romanticized image suggests, or whether underlying tensions of envy, grudges, and feuds simmered constantly. And in your lived experience, you know the truth lies somewhere in between, because while you depend on your neighbors, you also watch them with wary eyes, counting how many sheep they still have, how much smoke rises from their chimneys, wondering if they hoard while you hunger. Disputes sometimes flare into open conflict arguments over boundary lines, buried under snow accusations of theft when tracks lead to a neighbor's shed, bitter words about who shirked communal duties, and you witness how quickly survival can turn people against each other. Yet, you also know that reconciliation must come just as swiftly, for division threatens everyone, and so you swallow pride, mend fences, and extend hands, because winter leaves no room for enemies in a village already pressed to its limits. Inside your mind, you play out the delicate balance, the need to appear generous without giving too much away, the desire to protect your family without alienating allies, the struggle to endure the authority of your Lord without losing your dignity. And in each decision, you recognize that survival in this frozen season is not merely a matter of food and fire, but of diplomacy, trust, and the fragile bonds of human connection. You dream sometimes of living entirely apart, of escaping obligations, of hiding in the woods, with only your family and your fire. But you know such fantasies would collapse quickly, for no one survives alone in a medieval winter. And it is in this realization, both comforting and daunting, that you continue to weave your way through the cold. Months, step by step, word by word, holding on to the fragile but vital truth that togetherness, however imperfect, is the thread that keeps you from unraveling. As the weeks of snow and darkness stretch into what feels like an eternity, you begin to notice how the spiritual and superstitious rhythms of the season weave themselves into daily survival, because in a world where explanations for misfortune are scarce and science is a distant whisper, faith, ritual, and belief become tools as necessary as firewood or bread shaping how you understand and endure the endless cold, so you find yourself clinging to prayers as tightly as you clutch a blanket, whispering words in the dim candlelight and hoping they carry warmth into the void. The village church, though icy and drafty, becomes a center of winter life, its walls gathering the faithful who shuffle in, wrapped in cloaks, their breath rising in white clouds as the priest speaks of endurance, penance, and the hope of spring renewal. And even if you do not grasp all the Latin words you absorb, the rhythm, the chants, the flicker of candles that seem to push back the oppressive dark, you are reminded of the mainstream historical fact that medieval calendars were anchored by the liturgical year, and winter, in particular, was marked by major religious festivals like Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas, each one providing both spiritual reassurance and small breaks from routine moments when feasting or communal worship brought reprieve from the grind of survival. So while hunger gnaws at you, the promise of celebration gives you something to anticipate. Yet, alongside these sanctioned observances, the old beliefs linger stubbornly. Quirks of tradition passed down from ancestors, like the tidbit that in some villages, people burned a Yule log to protect their homes from evil, or placed bread and salt at thresholds to ward off wandering spirits. And you realize how seamlessly these folk customs intertwine with Christian rituals, neither fully replacing the other, but merging into a patchwork of practices that reassure anxious hearts. Historians still argue whether peasants truly maintained pre-Christian rituals in conscious defiance, or whether these traditions were simply absorbed unconsciously into daily life. And in your experience, you don't analyze. You just do what your parents did. Because when survival hangs by a thread, questioning the origins of rituals matters less than performing them with conviction. In the flickering firelight of winter nights, you listen to tales spun by elders of spirits that roam in the snow, of the wild hunt tearing through the skies, of witches who curse cattle or cause frost to linger. And though part of you doubts, another part feels a chill deeper than the cold, because belief itself exerts a power, shaping the way you see the wind howling outside or the strange shapes in drifting snow. Faith also intersects with practical survival. You kneel to pray for healing when your child coughs in the night, but you also steep herbs in hot water, and you do not see contradiction, because to you, both the prayer and the potion are part of the same struggle against forces larger than yourself. You know that the priest condemns certain charms or muttered spells as superstition, yet even he lights candles against the darkness, blesses fields, and invokes saints for protection. And so you learn to walk the thin line between orthodoxy and tradition, never sure where one ends and the other begins. Communal rituals to serve as glue, processions through the village, the blessing of homes, the ringing of bells to ward off storms. And in those shared actions, you feel less alone, because even if the wind still cuts to your bones, at least you face it together. But faith is not only comfort, it is also burden. For the priest warns that hunger and hardship are punishments for sin, and guilt begins to creep into your mind. Perhaps you did not pray enough. Perhaps you quarreled too bitterly with your neighbor. Perhaps God tests you, and you find yourself confessing more, kneeling longer, desperate to believe that repentance might lighten your load. At the same time, the weight of superstition can be heavy. A neighbor's sudden illness sparks whispers of witchcraft. Strange tracks in the snow stir fears of demons, and suspicion hangs in the air as thickly as smoke from damp logs, reminding you that in desperate times, fear can fracture bonds as quickly as it creates them. Yet you also see how faith fuels resilience. Songs sung in church lift weary hearts, charms whispered by mothers calm, anxious children's stories told by elders strengthen community ties, and in that mixture of belief and practice, you find the energy to rise each morning to face another day of frost and hunger. When the snow falls silently outside and you kneel at the foot of a crude wooden cross, you feel for a moment that you are not alone, that the light flickering on the altar promises spring as surely as the turning of the earth. And even if you cannot know when warmth will return, you carry that promise with you, tucked like an ember in your chest, enough to sustain you through the long night. As the final stretches of winter drag their heels, you notice how the rhythms of survival shift subtly from frantic scraping by to an exhausted kind of endurance, where the stores you've managed to preserve must be rationed with monk-like discipline, and every decision about food, warmth, or labor feels like a gamble against time. Because though the days grow ever so slightly longer, the cold seems more bitter than before, as if testing whether you can last just a little longer before surrendering. And you find yourself staring at the dwindling sacks of grain, counting handfuls of peas, slicing thinner and thinner portions of bread, each meal smaller than the last, yet still carrying the weight of hope. Because so long as something remains in the pot, you can still keep going. The mainstream historical fact comes to mind that most medieval peasants lived perpetually close to famine, with grain harvests often determining not just prosperity, but bare survival. And the hungry gap of late winter and early spring was dreaded across Europe. 4 stores ran low, and nothing new yet grew. And you realize, with a kind of sinking dread, that you are standing squarely inside that gap, clinging to what remains while praying the earth awakens soon. You adapt by thinning soups with more water, adding bits of dried herbs for flavor, stretching meals so they fill the belly even if they no longer satisfy. And though you sometimes feel weak from want, you also marvel at how inventive hunger makes you, chewing on bark for distraction, steeping roots for a bitter drink, gnawing at hardened cheese rinds that once you might have thrown away. Yet even amid this hardship, quirks of peasant ingenuity appear, and you remember the tidbit that some families boiled their belts or softened leather shoes to create an emergency meal, chewing endlessly at tough strips just to keep gnawing hunger from overwhelming them. And while the thought makes you grimace, you understand how desperation blurs the line between food and not food, survival demanding that nothing be wasted. Historians still argue whether famine was a regular annual occurrence for most peasants or an intermittent catastrophe triggered by bad harvests, with some claiming that people lived perpetually on the brink, and others suggesting they managed most years, but were undone by disaster. And standing in your cold cottage with your hands shaking from hunger, you feel the truth must lie somewhere in between. Because though you can endure with careful planning, the margin is razor thin, and one harsh winter tips everything into crisis. As days stretch into one another, you ration firewood too, no longer keeping the hearth burning constantly, but instead lighting it only at night, huddling with family around the faint flames, everyone wrapped in cloaks. And you notice how bodies pressed together become part of the survival strategy. Warmth shared, breaths mingling, a fragile cocoon against the biting air. Sleep becomes strange, fragmented as hunger gnaws at you in the night, yet dreams. Arrive vivid and unsettling visions of overflowing tables, steaming loaves, and endless sunlight, only to wake to frost on your blanket and the hollow rumble of your stomach. And though despair threatens, you force yourself to rise and keep going. Because giving up is unthinkable when those around you still depend on you. The community to phrase and binds in equal measure during this final trial. Neighbors whisper about who has more left hidden, who might share, who might steal. Yet, at the same time, you see families gathering to pool scraps into communal stews because survival often requires collective endurance, not solitary hoarding. Work continues despite weakness. Animals must still be tended, fences checked, tools prepared for spring. And though each task takes longer, you know that falling behind now only deepens the crisis when thaw arrives. So you trudge through snow with aching limbs, muttering prayers under your breath, each breath a small defiance against the void. And still amid the hunger, rituals of hope persist. You mark the days until Candlemas light candles, not just for faith, but as a reminder that darkness does not last forever. And you cling to tales told by elders that spring always comes, even if it feels impossibly far away. Sometimes you imagine what future generations might think, whether they would laugh at the thought of chewing leather for sustenance or shake their heads in disbelief. And you wonder if perhaps they too will live always on the edge of want. For hunger is an ancient companion of humankind, never fully banished, only postponed by the harvest. Yet even in your weakest moments, when you chew slowly on a thin crust and sip watery broth, you feel a stubborn spark, the knowledge that survival is not just about food, but about refusing to let despair consume you before the winter does. And so you sit by the dim glow of ember, stomach aching, but spirit unbroken, whispering to yourself that soon the snow will melt, soon the fields will stir, soon the balance will shift, and until then, you will endure, because that is what peasants do. You rise on what feels like the last morning of the endless cold, the sky pale and strained, with the faintest suggestion of change, and though snow still blankets the ground in uneven mounds, and the air still burns in your lungs, you sense that something is shifting. Some quiet promise that the brutal winter is loosening its grip. Yet the weeks ahead remain the most delicate, because the line between survival and collapse is razor thin. And you know that what you do now determines whether you step into spring with strength or stumble into it half broken, carrying scars of hunger, frostbite, and fatigue. You begin by taking stock of everything remaining: your food, your fuel, your tools, and though the sight is grim, it is not nothing. And you feel a stubborn gratitude for every dried pea, every handful of grain, every last bundle of firewood carefully set aside, for they are proof that you have endured this long and can endure a little longer. A mainstream historical fact floats into your mind. In much of medieval Europe, this late winter limbo was referred to as the starving time, when old stores had nearly vanished and new crops had yet to sprout. And chroniclers recorded that even lords and monasteries felt the pinch, though peasants, of course, bore the worst, sometimes reduced to eating weeds, nettles, or boiled tree bark. And you realize how universal your struggle is, repeated across countless villages, a season of shared suffering that binds everyone together in fragile solidarity. You adapt in small ways, making watery pottage with whatever scraps remain, gnawing carefully at bones you might have once discarded, simmering them for hours to draw out the last trace of nourishment. And though the meals are meager, they are rituals of persistence, and each bowl placed before you feels like a small victory. Quirks of survival emerge too, some almost laughable, like the tidbit that people sometimes sprinkled crushed oyster shells or powdered bones into bread to make it stretch farther, creating loaves that filled the stomach but wore down teeth, and you smiled despite yourself, imagining the grim crunch with every bite. Proof that desperation can inspire both ingenuity and absurdity in equal measure. Historians still argue whether these starvation tactics were widespread norms or exceptions in times of catastrophe, with some suggesting that most years were survivable with careful planning, while others insist that famine lurked at the edge of nearly every winter. But as you sit in your cold cottage, belly faintly hollow, but spirit unyielding, you suspect that the truth is messy somewhere. Between daily hardship and occasional collapse, and the experience of survival was deeply individual. Some villages managing well, others pushed to breaking. You spend your days maintaining the fragile routines, tending animals with a gentleness born of mutual dependence. Because your chickens and goats, though thin, still give eggs and milk that are lifelines. Mending tools in preparation for fields that will one day thaw. Scraping ice from the cottage roof so it does not collapse under weight. And each act, though small, becomes an anchor, holding you steady against the current of exhaustion. You also cling to faith, because the church calendar, with its rhythm of feast days and saint celebrations, gives structure to the bleakness, and though Lent means fasting, you reinterpret it as endurance. You are already practicing as if your suffering aligns with holy sacrifice, granting it meaning beyond bare necessity. In the evenings, when the sun dips early, you huddle with family near the embers, telling stories of summers past, of harvest festivals and dancing, of warm bread fresh from the oven. And you can see in children's eyes that such stories are more than distractions. They are promises, a way of holding spring alive in imagination until the earth delivers it for real. Sometimes despair creeps in, nonetheless, when the wind howls and hunger gnaws and fatigue feels unbearable. But you push through with stubborn ritual. One more log on the fire, one more turn of the prayer beads, one more whispered vow that you will not fall before the thaw. And when at last you step outside one morning and notice a trickle of water cutting through the snow, hear a bird's tentative song, or feel the faintest warmth on your face, the relief is so immense that tears come unbidden. For it is proof that you have endured the unendurable, that spring has answered your persistence, that the season of death is yielding to the season of life. And though you are thinner now, weaker, scarred in small ways by frost and hunger, you are also alive, and that is everything, because survival is not about comfort or ease. It is about stubbornly refusing to stop, and in that refusal, you are part of an unbroken chain of peasants who endured countless brutal winters before you, each leaving behind not stories of grand victories, but the quiet triumph of simply lasting long enough to see the thaw. And now, as the last echoes of this long winter fade, let yourself imagine the cold softening, the snow slowly shrinking into rivulets that trickle away into the soil, carrying with them the sharp edge of suffering and leaving only the promise of green. Picture yourself sitting near the hearth, the fire no longer desperate, but steady, gentle, a companion, rather than a battle. And outside the air has shifted, carrying a hint of wet earth, a whisper of grass, the first shy sense of renewal. You breathe more easily, your shoulders loosening, because the struggle has carried you here to this moment of release, where survival transforms into rest. Your hands are rough, your body thinner, yet your heart feels fuller, knowing that what was endured is proof of resilience, that no storm lasts forever, and that even in the harshest season, persistence carries you through. The voices of children soften into laughter again. The songs of neighbors rise in the air, and you feel part of something vast, a tapestry of endurance woven across centuries. Let yourself rest now, knowing the fields will wake, the animals will thrive, and your body, weary but unbroken, will grow strong again with the return of warmth. The night is quieter now, not oppressive but calm, and you can finally let go of the sharp edge of fear, surrendering to the comfort of stillness. Allow the imagery to soften around you, the glow of embers dimming slowly, the hush of wind through bare branches fading into silence, the faint trickle of meltwater blending into the background like a lullaby. Breathe in, breathe out, and know you are safe.